I'm Steve Keogh, a former Scotland Yard murder detective inspector. I'm going to take you deep inside murder investigations.
When you create a tissue of lies, it's difficult to remember sometimes what lies you've told to what people. It's unbelievable, really. Quite an incredible story.
Opening my contacts book for the first time to reveal the secrets of what it really takes to be a murder detective.
We were hoping that with the advances in forensic science that we may find additional samples within the remains of Julian.
On the front line, exposing how we solve the most heinous of crimes.
Anybody who's able to manipulate those people around them so skillfully is actually very dangerous in my view, because there's no reason for them to stop.
Welcome to Secrets of a Murder Detective. The year 2000 cold case reinvestigation of Julian Webb's death was one of West Sussex's most challenging cases. Julian Webb died in 1994. His wife Dina's account was that he'd taken his own life, but his mother Rosemary always had doubts about Dina's version of events. The case was reopened in 2000 when Dina's third husband, Richard Thompson, went to the police claiming that he'd been attacked by Dina and that she had tried to kill him. Today, I'm going to be meeting the Senior Investigating Officer of the Julian Webb reinvestigation, where we'll be discussing the challenges and the setbacks and the eventual evidence that brought the killer to justice.
My name is Kevin Moore. I'm a retired Detective Chief Superintendent and was formerly the head of Sussex Police's CID.
Kevin, thanks for coming in. Really good to meet you.
And you, Steve.
So a case that came into Sussex Police related to Richard Thompson. What can you tell me about that case?
It was his account that he had formed a relationship with Dina Thompson, which ultimately led to a bizarre sex game on New Year's Day 2000, where he had been bound, gagged and blindfolded. He was then laying incapacitated, in effect, and at this time she took possession of an aluminium baseball bat and started to strike him about the head and body, causing pretty serious injuries. She was also in possession of a knife and used this to stab him on more than one occasion in the shoulder. Richard Thompson managed to free himself and defend himself, and during the course of this, Dina dropped the knife. Luckily for him, he managed to repel the rest of the attack and escape from the premises where this took place.
If Richard Thompson hadn't have escaped, what do you think would have happened to him?
Well, I think it's by some miracle that he managed to free himself, because if he hadn't have done, I've got absolutely no doubt he would have died at her hands. Subsequently, it was obviously reported to police, and an investigation was commenced and was one of attempted murder. It also transpired during the course of that she had been stealing and defrauding Richard Thompson of various of his monies. And that was then linked to some other similar thefts and frauds from other males that she had been involved with over the years. Dina Thompson was subsequently tried for the attempted murder of Richard Thompson.
She went on trial at Lewes Crown Court, and this is where Dina's amazing charms and her ability to beguile people was seen in public for the first time. My name is Paul Cheston. I was the courts correspondent of London Evening Standard for 23 years. She claimed that she and Richard had a row and that Richard had attacked her, so she had defended herself, and that Richard's injuries were caused by her, but only in self-defence.
She said she had told Richard Thompson about the missing money, and as a result of that, he had attacked her, and the jury had believed that. On August the 17th, 2000, Dina was acquitted, with the jury having accepted her version that she had acted in self-defence.
However, she did not walk free from court that day. Unbeknown to the jury, she had by that time pleaded guilty to a large number of charges of defrauding Richard Thompson and previous lovers of £12,000 in cash. she was jailed for 3 years and 9 months.
The in-depth investigation into Richard Thompson's murder had put a spotlight onto Dina Thompson.
So on the face of it, that sounds like quite a disappointing outcome. He was tied up, blindfolded, beaten and stabbed. I know with juries you can never predict the outcome of a case. The team from Sussex must have been disappointed with that outcome.
Absolutely. I think that was one of the reasons that it triggered a whole look at other matters that we thought that ultimately she had been involved in. It gave an added impetus to that because this was a woman that we felt was quite malicious, quite determined and a fraudster in the way she conducted her life. And it was generally felt that other men could become victims of hers in the future. At that time, I was the detective superintendent in charge of what we used to call the Crime Policy and Review branch. I was actually responsible for setting up the Major Crime Review function, and part of that was looking at old and cold cases.
What did that prompt you and your team to do?
Following the acquittal of Richard Thompson, that's where I became involved because I was appointed to oversee a fresh investigation looking at Dina Thompson, looking at her history, and in particular focusing on the death of Julian Webb, which had originally determined an open verdict.
Dina Thompson was born Dina Holmes and was brought up in Hendon, which is a nice part of North London. Her father was involved in training gymnasts, and Dina got to travel overseas with him on his job. From an early life, she developed her interest in the good things in life: expensive clothes, nice holidays. What she didn't like was having to earn money to pay for it.
So Kevin, essentially you're leading a cold case investigation. A lot of that would involve looking at the previous investigation, seeing what may have been missed. What was the picture you built up of a relationship between Dina and Julia?
Well, I think to all intents and purposes and to outsiders, to most outsiders, they appeared to be like a normal couple.
By 1991, Dina's met Julian Webb. He was an advertising manager for the local newspaper in Portsmouth. And she so charmed him so successfully that in a whirlwind romance lasting no more than 3 months, they were walking down the aisle and she was now Mrs. Webb.
Julian came across as being a very ordinary individual. He liked to keep fit, he liked fishing, he liked a bit of travel. He was spoken of very positively by his work colleagues where he was working. He was, to all intents and purposes, a very decent man.
Well, certainly Julian was in love with Dina. There's no question about that. He had fallen for her. He was truly smitten. His mother, Rosemary, a school teacher, had her grave suspicions. She had her mother's instinct that Dina was a wrong 'un. And she told Julian, but he wouldn't listen to it. He was head over heels in love.
An important element of your reinvestigation of Julian's death would have been an understanding of what went on. What was your understanding of what happened that day?
Julian's death occurred in 1994. It was on the 30th of June, which was actually Julian's birthday, that Rosemary Webb, his mother, phoned the house in order to speak to Julian on his birthday. Dina actually answered the phone and told Rosemary that Julian was actually very poorly and wouldn't be able to come to the phone and was in bed. It was during that night that Dina ran to her neighbour's house and stated that Julian had stopped breathing and therefore she had phoned for an ambulance and appeared to be in some distress at that time. Although ultimately the neighbours were quite surprised about how quickly she resumed a fairly stable feeling. The paramedics arrived and ultimately stated that Julian had unfortunately died.
When the paramedics arrived, Dina seems almost indifferent to Julian's death. My name is Dr. Shahan Das. I am a forensic psychiatrist. She's more excited about the prospect of riding in the ambulance, and her neighbours pick up on this. This bizarre behaviour should have been a red flag to the investigators, because it'd be very unusual for somebody that supposedly loves their partner to react in such a callous way. Maybe, in a moment of weakness, her mask actually slipped.
Cold case murder investigations are really interesting, but I think they're quite often misunderstood. Generally, if you're going to solve a cold case, it's going to be evidence that's going to come from one of three areas. It's going to be new information passed to the team from witnesses, or it may come from advances in forensic science, for instance, new techniques within DNA or fingerprinting that wouldn't have been available to the original investigating team. Or finally, it may be from mistakes or missed opportunities from the original investigation.
Dina had always suggested that Julian was suffering from some form of depressive illness, and that as a result he had been taking antidepressant tablets, even though he hadn't received those through his own GP. Following the investigation into Julian's death, which took place originally, a case was obviously presented to the coroner and an inquest was held. Ultimately, his cause of death was down to an overdose of antidepressants and aspirin, and really it came down to two things. Was Julian the victim of a murder, or did he commit suicide? Ultimately, the coroner recorded an open verdict on the basis that it couldn't be determined categorically that he committed suicide, or indeed that there was evidence to suggest that Dina, or anybody else for that matter, had caused his death.
When somebody dies suddenly, police will investigate the circumstances of the death, the purpose of which is to establish a cause. But these processes aren't foolproof and mistakes can be made. Occasionally, murders can be missed. You start off with an idea that you think this is likely to have been the scenario.
Yes.
But you don't know that for sure, do you?
No, and of course I've always said that a good investigator, a good SIO, develops decent hypotheses. And of course this case was no different. You had to accept that one hypothesis was that Julian had committed suicide. By the same token, the main hypothesis was that he had been killed, and the only person capable of killing him in those circumstances was his wife, Dina.
How many detectives would have investigated Julian's death first time round? Would have been less than a handful.
Yeah.
Now you've got a full team of everybody pulling together, and it's going to get a better service, isn't it?
That's definitely the case, and it has to reach a certain threshold. And I guess what happened was, sadly, the original case involving the death of Julian, it was looked at in isolation. There wasn't any real other supporting evidence, and so therefore, what have you got? You've got a dead man, you've got the fact that he's consumed antidepressants and aspirin to the extent where it's actually killed him, but how has that been administered? Was it administered to him deliberately, or did he take it himself? And those questions remained unanswered. So therefore, it wasn't surprising that the case didn't get progressed further at that time. We had the advantage, I suppose, of looking at it and saying, well, hang on a minute, she's attempted to murder Richard Thompson, although she was ultimately found not guilty. Certain things that featured in that case also featured in the case involving the death of Julian Webb.
So, when you look at one case individually, sometimes things might not become so important. When you bring them all together and you see the consistencies throughout them, and that's what you started to see. You started to see these commonalities.
Absolutely, yeah.
When you're pulling together the information from different witnesses, an important stage is to compare what people are saying. Did you notice any discrepancies between the witness accounts, particularly around what Dina was telling them?
Yeah, very much so. That was very much the case. I mean, if, for instance, you take the account of Rosemary Webb, who telephoned the home in order to speak to Julian on his birthday, she is told by Dina that he hasn't eaten and he's taken to his bed. Other people, she's told that they celebrated his birthday by her making him a hot curry. Some people, she told, he was very depressed, but Rosemary, she didn't believe he was depressed because he had been talking in a very positive way about visiting Florida, about going on a fishing trip, the sort of things you wouldn't talk about if you were intending to take your own life within the next few hours.
He had a future in his mind and what he was portraying.
Exactly that. Those discrepancies, I think, were pretty significant because it actually shows that she's never stuck to the same story, and clearly when you create a tissue of lies, it's difficult to remember sometimes what lies you've told to what people.
So you're leading on a cold case investigation. Where did you start? What was your starting point in the investigation?
Well, we re-looked at a lot of the documentation that was obtained and taken during the original investigation into Julian's death. And from that, we were actually able to identify other potential lines of inquiry, other witnesses that could corroborate or substantiate some of the things that we knew subsequently. What we also did was we tried to focus on the particular individuals that we had named as having had a relationship with Dina. And by piecing that all together, it revealed quite a concerning, consistent pattern of events.
So you're doing a great job of building a picture of Dina's life and relationships. What did you find that went on before Julian?
The story starts really with Dina meeting up and ultimately marrying Lee Wyatt.
Dina married Lee Wyatt in 1984. He was a fairground attendant, and it's fair to say he was a gullible character.
And then they had a son together in 1987. And around that time, they started up a soft toy business together. And one particular toy, known as Shaun the Leprechaun, the rights to it were sought by Aer Lingus, who were going to give them as gifts to first-class air passengers. Dina stated that they'd also been approached by Disney to buy the rights to Shaun the Leprechaun. And this is where something quite unbelievable then happens, because she describes how the mafia have got involved in this, and they want to secure some of the profits from that deal. And if they don't cooperate, then harm will come to Lee and Dina. So she manages to convince Lee that one way of avoiding this would be for him to go on the run. Lee, operating under the belief that the threat made by the mafia was a real threat, then disappears down to Cornwall, and he starts work. He starts in a job down there and is paying his wages into Dina's account back home. Clearly, this was the forerunner to her activities involving lovers, where she was seeking to gain financial advantage from her various lies and stories.
Of course, many people lie for financial gain. That's not a new concept. But what really stands out to me is the ease in which Dina lies. You know, it's the detail, it's the complexity of it all. So to me, that really speaks to her natural personality. There's something that's very ingrained about her that is deceptive and manipulative.
So at the age of 24, Dina clearly had mapped out in her mind how her life was going to progress. And Lee Wyatt, nice bloke that he wasn't going to hack it for her, because he was not the source of money that she needed to fund her extravagant lifestyle. But this ensured that Lee was out of the way and cleared the field for Dina to put phase 2 of her plan into action.
It was after Lee had been away from the home for some time, and the neighbours indeed hadn't seen him for some time, that they became aware of the appearance of what turned out to be Julian Webb. She met up with Julian Webb and ultimately marries him, despite the fact she's still already married to Lee Wyatt, and so therefore her marriage to Julian was in fact bigamous.
So all the while, Lee is on the run thinking that Dina is at home waiting for him, but in actuality, Dina has moved on with her life. And this really indicates this huge lack of empathy towards somebody who clearly is still very much enamoured by her. What strikes me about Dina is not only the ease at which she deceives, but also the fact that she's able to compartmentalise, not just details, but it feels like actual emotions. She's able to live this double life simultaneously.
Is it fair to say that the family of Julian Webb weren't comfortable that he'd committed suicide?
Definitely not. And indeed, Julian's mother, Rosemary Webb, was vehement that Julian had been killed by Dina right from day one.
The day after he died, Dina headed straight to his office at the Portsmouth News, the newspaper where Julian worked, and demanded that they should pay up his death-in-service payment, which was amounted to £36,000, which is a considerable amount of money, on the basis that she was his next of kin. And she wanted the money, and she wanted it pretty quick, thank you.
So that's fairly callous, really, when you think about it.
It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? If your husband's just passed away, your first thought is to go to his work and see what money you could get. Well, that gives you a glimpse, doesn't it, of what motivates.
Absolutely.
Rosemary already had a lot of doubts about her son's death, and then you add in this bizarre, seemingly greedy behaviour by Dina, and it only adds to her suspicions.
One of the initial things we did was obviously make contact with Rosemary Webb, Julian's mother. And one of the things we were able to do as a result of that was to gain her permission to have Julian's body exhumed to see if there was any other forensic opportunities around samples that may have been obtained from his body. It's fair to say that exhumations are very rare in policing, and indeed in the whole of my service I've only ever been involved in this one and one other. And it's a difficult thing to do, to have to approach the next of kin of a deceased, asking for their consent and permission to actually dig up the remains of their son, in this case as it was. The good thing from our point of view was that Rosemary Webb had always believed that Julian had been murdered by Dina. Therefore, she was cooperative in terms of giving us permission, giving her consent for the exhumation to take place, thus speeding things up in terms of gaining the consent of Her Majesty's coroner.
Detectives make the decision to exhume the body of Julian Webb. Now, this is really unusual. In a police career, I've come across it once or twice. So for them to make this decision, it isn't one that they would have made lightly. And it's for several reasons. One, and probably the least important one, is it's a costly procedure. But more importantly is the emotional impact it has on family members. They're taking their loved one out of their grave, and that can be hard to face. But it was a really important decision, and one I feel they had to make.
The exhumation of Julian's body actually took place during October 2001.
So when you did that, what were you hoping to find?
We were hoping that with the advances of forensic medicine and forensic science that we may find additional samples or substances within the remains of Julian. Sadly, that was not to be the case. There was no additional evidence obtained via the exhumation.
It must have been hugely disappointing when you're hoping for something to happen and it doesn't, and you basically feel like you're back at square one, I imagine.
Absolutely, and I'll be telling a lie if I didn't say that was the case here. You know, the team took a bit of a hit when we didn't get the result we were looking for, but then, you know, the way I put it to the investigating team was this: we'd done a lot of work up until now, and the way we were going was I was confident that we would get sufficient evidence circumstantially to put a decent proposition towards the CPS to suggest that Dina should be charged with Julian's murder.
So part of the process that you and your team would be going through would be building up a picture of Julian's life. But you were unravelling a side of his life that he wasn't aware of. What was going on that he had no idea of?
Well, a classic case in point is actually the fact that Dina had told him that she was suffering from a terminal illness. But in fact, that was to act as cover for the fact the Woolwich Building Society, where she worked, had unearthed a discrepancy of over £20,000, which they believed she was responsible for. And so therefore she was under investigation for that and was no longer at work. So she had to give some sort of explanation to Julian as to why she wasn't at work.
Dina then blames the missing money on her first husband, Lee Wyatt, and she manages to convince him to write her threatening letters and also to leave threatening voicemail messages. Now, she's told him that he needs to do this so that she can get protection from the mafia, but in actuality, she's just building up evidence in case she needs it in the future to frame him. So it feels like there's literally no bounds to her manipulation. So there clearly is a financial motive for a lot of her actions. And to me, we're getting the picture of somebody who's basically a con artist with multiple victims, including romantic partners. It feels like she views every single scenario, relationship, person, even her job, as just an opportunity to try and manipulate, to try and squeeze something out of.
During the early years of this marriage, a black cloud arrived for Dina because suddenly Lee Wyatt came back into her life. Tired of being on the run, and perhaps by now, albeit many years too late, smelling a rat, he had got back in touch with Dina. And this was a problem for Dina because if Lee ever met Julian, not only would they find out that they were both married to the same woman, but they would recognise her double life.
That was why the timing was important, because I guess at that point she'd decided there was too much risk that Julian would find out about Lee and the fact that she was still married to Lee.
It's important with a timeline, isn't it? Because what you're often looking for is triggers. What has gone on there to trigger this behaviour?
Yeah, very much so. And I think undoubtedly in her case, things were coming on top. There were lots of things happening. There was a theft from the building society, Lee coming back into the picture, the risk that Julian would find out about A, the theft, and B, find out fully about Lee. So undoubtedly, that in terms of the time, as you say, that would have explained a lot of why Julian died around the time that he did.
She's moving on pretty quickly, and not only emotionally, she moves on relationship-wise, doesn't she? She then meets somebody else.
Yeah, she does. And then because it wasn't a relatively short time later, that she met Robert Waite, who she formed a relationship with.
She very quickly tells Robert that she's suffering from a terminal illness. So once again, this is very much in the MO and the pattern that Dina has, finding men that she can manipulate, lying to them, saying whatever she needs to, just to get anything she can from them. Robert Waite is now the third person in this story that Dina has managed to exploit. So it feels like there's a very clear pattern in her behaviour. She keeps doing the same thing, and why change her behaviour? After all, from her perspective, she's successful. She says that she wants to spend her final months in Florida and convinces him to move out there with her. But of course, she needs some kind of endgame if he thinks that she's imminently about to die. She manages to leave this relationship by lying to Robert, convincing him that she's flying to New York so that she can give evidence as a witness in a mafia trial. Whereas in actual fact, she has to fly over to Britain to give evidence in a trial related to her part in defrauding Woolwich Building Society.
So she came back from Florida to stand trial for the fraud. What happened during that?
Dina was being investigated for the theft of in excess of £20,000. She was found guilty at the trial. Indeed, it was on the 31st of August 1995 that Dina was sent to prison for 18 months as a result of her theft from the Woolwich Building Society. Robert Waite was actually left in Florida penniless and without a means of getting back to the UK himself, which ultimately led to him being arrested and deported for having no funds.
Anybody who's able to manipulate those people around them so skillfully is actually very dangerous in my view, because there's no reason for them to stop and there's no limit from what they can achieve. After coming out of prison, Dina then starts another relationship with a man, and she once again lies to him, saying that she has throat cancer. And then he notices that his bank cards and some of his money have gone missing and finds out that Dina is the reason. That ended their relationship very quickly after that. And so, therefore, the impact of his relationship with Dina wasn't as much or as grave as it was with some of the other individuals.
But again, it shows that pattern of entering a relationship and
absolutely, yeah, manipulating individuals, trying to seek financial gain. Yeah, it's unbelievable, really. Quite an incredible story. Between 1997 and 98, Dina actually divorced Lee Wyatt finally, and that was what then led to her starting her relationship with Richard Thompson.
Richard Thompson was a businessman. They met in one of Dina's favourite romances, which was in a Lonely Hearts column. She found many different lovers that way, and it was an easy opportunity to assess various people who were on the lookout for love. They married in the 90s, and within a very short period of time, she was forging his signature, trashing his bank account, and running up massive debts on his credit card. 2 years into their marriage, Dina had run out of money and wanted a lot more. She concocted a plan that would solve her problems as far as she could see it. Richard Thompson was planning a trip to Florida.
Dina made plans to kill Richard, plus cover up his murder by saying that he was in America at the time. So we are definitely seeing an escalation of behaviour.
On the night before he was due to leave, Dina smashed him around the head with a baseball bat and tried to stab him with a knife. And the plan was that she would sell the house by telling everybody that Richard had gone to Florida and he wasn't coming back. It was an audacious plan, but Richard had managed to thwart it. He left the house immediately and called the police, and she was arrested.
Even though Dina Thompson was found not guilty of the attempted murder of Richard Thompson, it raised questions around the circumstances of the death of Julian Webb.
It was on the 7th of August 2002 that some of my officers arrested Dina Thompson at her home address, and she was taken to Worthing Police Station for questioning in connection with the death of Julian.
So there are levels of interview within the police, aren't there?
There are, yeah.
And what level of interview would you have had to do this?
We use advanced interviewers, so they've been trained in techniques to draw out an account from an individual and then test that account and then deal with discrepancies within the account given. And in her case, she would still remain fairly devious because, in effect, what she was saying, particularly around Julian's death, was that while she may have given different accounts, it was a mistake or an error on her part. There wasn't anything sinister about it. And it was almost like we should feel sorry for her because of the distressing circumstances. So therefore, it's not surprising that she came out with an account full of discrepancies. Right through the interview, Dina played down the discrepancies, although she admitted that she had told different stories to different people, and ultimately denied responsibility for Julian's death.
I find that really interesting because you've talked about her, she tries to talk her way out of things. And that's what she's trying to do there. She's trying to manipulate the police, isn't she? She's trying to talk her way out of a charge, out of trouble. And that all, again, it comes back to that she's in control and she wants to manipulate people. But that was probably one of the undoings of her, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
So it seems that her previous ability to manipulate, to deceive, is not really working on the police. And of course, it's much easier to lie to somebody like a partner who loves you and who believes in you than to lie to a cynical murder detective.
I felt that we had a very strong case circumstantially based on all of the evidence put together, but it was part and parcel of the whole story that was sufficiently strong to convince the CPS that yes, this was a case where Dina Thompson should be charged and face a trial for murder. It was fair to say that we had to convince them that the heavily circumstantial evidence that we had in our possession was what the case would ultimately be dealt with at court. There wasn't the normal so-called golden nugget here where there's a significant amount of forensic evidence which showed that the accused was guilty. This case ultimately involved the accounts of lots of different people showing the various discrepancies and actions of Dina over a period of years. Ultimately, Dina pleaded not guilty and the case was set for hearing in November 2003.
Dina went back on trial, this time at the Old Bailey, in 2003, accused of the murder of Julian Webb. Dina sat in the dock with her rather typical expression of, "I'm just a woman in a cruel man's world." She tried to put on the whole charm to the Old Bailey jury. And she tried every effort to try and show that she was the victim and that she'd lost her husband in tragic circumstances. Watching Dina in the dock was a masterclass in attempted jury manipulation. I could see straight away what she was up to, and I suspect the jurors could as well.
When a murder goes to court and there's a trial, quite often it can turn on one very small point, and that's the case here. Julian Webb died because of the drugs within his system, but the point for the jury was, did he do that himself, or was he given those drugs by Dina Thompson?
The prosecution made out a very clear case that Dina had spent a lifetime of deception and lies to her husband. On Julian's 31st birthday, Dina told him that she would make him his favourite meal of really hot curry. Not only had she ground aspirin and put it into his drink, she crushed antidepressant tablets and stirred that into the curry.
The method that she uses is fascinating to me. But something about this feels very detached and callous. There's a physical distance between her and a victim. Of course, death by overdose is usually very slow and very painful, so I do wonder whether Julian was lucid enough at the time to be able to think about what was happening to him and who caused it.
Lee Wyatt gave evidence, and he was clearly a very angry man. He realised just what a fool Dina had taken him for. And he came out with the compelling evidence about what a twisted, evil, cunning and manipulative woman she was. And this played very heavily on the jury's mind.
What defence did Dina and her trial counsel put across?
Well, I think it was just a case that she didn't do it and that she was a victim of circumstance and an innuendo, and there wasn't any solid evidence to say that she was responsible for Julian's death. I suppose it was a classic case for the defence to try to muddy the waters as best as they can and undermine the prosecution case in doing so.
And a big part of that is, sadly, often attacking the victim, isn't it? And trying to paint the victim in a certain light or paint their life in a certain light. And on this occasion, I assume it's around the depression and trying to paint Julian as somebody who was likely to take his life. Is that fair?
I think that's probably fair, yeah. I think the image that was portrayed by them was that he was a vulnerable individual, vulnerable because of his state of mind and the fact that he was possibly very ill at the time.
Dina had concocted the story that Julian had committed suicide. And from my clinical experience as a psychiatrist, very occasionally there are cases where somebody would do something like this without any red flag warning signs, but it's far more common for there to be signs like low mood, loss of interest, isolating oneself from my friends and family. None of that was relevant for Julian.
When you investigate murder, motive is a funny thing, really, because You don't have to prove motive, do you? But it does help, doesn't it? Because when you're sitting in front of a jury and you're trying to persuade them to find someone guilty of murder, a natural question that a jury have is, well, why did they do it? They want to know. So in this, the motive was clear, really, wasn't it? And it was a motive that she'd displayed throughout all the relationships that you'd seen.
I think that's absolutely right. I think in this particular case, it was critical, actually, because when you haven't got any other so-called golden nuggets, like some forensic evidence or DNA or something that tends to suggest that nobody else could have ever done it and it must be that person who's committed the offence, that wasn't present in this case. So we were relying on putting together a case where we were saying that despite all of that, we're still saying that this woman killed Julian Webb. So the motive, I think, was important, and I think it was very clear in this case. She was a devious, vindictive individual underneath her sort of the persona she portrayed outside of that, and was an exceptionally greedy and money-oriented individual. And money, I think, was the root of all of the motivation that she needed to carry out the crimes that she did commit.
So at the end of the main part of the trial, the jury will go out and deliberate on their decision. What did they come back? What was their finding?
It was in December 2003, after a month-long trial, that Dina Thompson was found guilty of Julian's murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment.
The jury spent considerable time in deliberating, but came back with a majority verdict of guilty of murder. Now, the majority verdict is interesting because it proved that at least one, if not two, jurors had actually either believed Dina's defence, that she was innocent, or else believed that the prosecution had not proved beyond reasonable doubt. But it still seemed to me amazing that anybody could believe that Dina was anything other than a very guilty, dangerous, evil, manipulative woman.
In 2007, Dina appeared at the High Court, where the court determined that her life sentence would amount to a total of 16 years imprisonment, which meant that her earliest release date was 2019. The judge at her trial stated that Dina Thompson was utterly ruthless and without pity. I would actually go much further than that and say that she's a danger to men who seem to have managed to fall under her spell and put themselves in danger as a result.
What sort of wife kills a husband? And what sort of wife kills a husband for money? It is an extraordinary question. It defies belief.
Taking a step back and looking at this case as a whole, one thing that jumps out to me is that she has many of the features of a psychopath. She is cold and she lacks emotion. She's superficially charming, but also quite glib. She relentlessly lies to people. She doesn't learn from her mistakes. She's criminally versatile. She's impulsive, but mostly because she's very charming and manipulative. She's very good at hiding in plain sight. So she ticks a lot of boxes when it comes to diagnosing psychopathy.
I think it's fair to say that the case brought about a considerable amount of satisfaction within the investigation team, on the basis that this was a woman who had committed a murder and then for a further 10 years lived a life in the way that she did. I refer to this case as one of those that the end result is achieved through dogged detective work, so gaining accounts from witnesses, gathering evidence that is perhaps you wouldn't ordinarily say straight away is going to prove or disprove a case. But nonetheless, if you piece it together with lots of other pieces of evidence, it may actually help to prove the case. So it was a case really of pulling all the bits and pieces together and then effectively saying to the jury, well, What other explanation can there be other than the fact that Julian Webb was murdered by his wife?
I was very much a 21st century murder detective. For the crimes I investigated, I had tools open to me such as cell site analysis and the latest advances in forensic science, none of which would have been available to the detectives investigating the death of Julian Webb. They had to use good old detective work, and it's because of that they have my utmost respect.
Following her conviction, Dina Thompson was referred to in the media as the Black Widow. Indeed, at the end of this, she was caught up in her own web of lies and manipulation of male partners in order to secure their money.
As a murder detective, all the work you do is really for two sets of people. First, it's the victim, to give them a voice and get them the justice that they deserve. But it's also for the people they've left behind. In this instance, it was Julian's mother, Rosemary Webb, and it took nearly 10 years for her to get the answers she needed and the justice that she deserved.